Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Charlie McIntyre. Hello there. We've talked about characters on the Scrapbook program, and we've recited the tales of some of the saltiest, most colorful, and most interesting of Grays Harbor characters out of the past. But there is at least one that must be included, because for sheer strength of character, a resolute Irishman who called Copalas home port for most of his life is one of the greatest figures out of the harbor's interesting years. His name was Charlie McIntyre. He was born in Ballyshannon on the Donegal Bay, Ireland, and he came to the Pacific Northwest after hearing the stories of an uncle named Andy McGee, who had once been a miner on the Fraser River during the big gold strike and who returned to Ireland in 1859. To a young Irish lad, with the stuff of adventure in his veins and the wandering heart, the stories of Andy McGee told were sheer romance, and there were stories of the greatest wealth and greatest wilderness, of towering mountains and wild game beyond all imagined. Moreover, there were stories of adventure in which young men could play a part. There were stories of the way of life that young men's hearts could understand, and Charlie McIntyre set out to live them. He sailed for Philadelphia, arriving there in the spring of 1873, and for 3 years he held the first stop in the New World as he soaked up the vastness of the great western city, the excitement of its waterfront, and opportunities for enterprise. He made money, he saved it, and through it all he was never a confirmed Philadelphian. He kept his eyes fixed on distant corners of the country, and in 1873 he took one of the newly completed railroads across the continent and arrived in California. From there was a boat to Portland, to Olympia by stage, and to Montesano on foot. It was the Grays Harbor of 1876. He made the last lap down the river to the coast in a dugout canoe, paddling to Peterson Point, where Westport now stands, and then crossing the harbor's mouth with his little boat to Lone Pine Tree Point. You may wonder how a young Irishman unfamiliar with the rugged and almost uninhabitable West struck such a straight line to Lone Tree, and why he sought out this chunk of windswept and scrub pine. As a matter of fact, he had a purpose. It was to find another uncle, Matthew McGee, who had remained in the Northwest and who had, it was rumored, been captured or murdered by Native Americans. Uncle Matthew had come to the territory ahead of Governor Stevens, and the lack of communication and transportation had marooned him on the North Beaches. Only rumors came out of the beach country of his whereabouts, and they proved to be unfounded. For near the Lone Tree were reports picked up along his tout that had indicated that Uncle Matthew had been last seen. There Charlie found the missing relative. Now, with Uncle Matt was a man named Grover, a remarkable man of many experiences. He had marched to the sea with Sherman. He was a college man, a frontier man, a hunter, and a man of great character and leadership. His marksmanship with a rifle was famous all over the Northwest, and his ability to get along with almost everyone had built out of a reputation as being a superior being. Young Charlie shook the hand of this frontiersman, and there, beside the lone tree that had guided Captain Gray into the harbor on his voyage of discovery, they cemented a friendship that would last for more than 40 years. Grover, like the young Irishman, and undertook to teach him the way of the West. With his instructor, McIntyre hunted, trapped, and went into the freighting business, moving cargo up the coast in buckboard wagons. These men, Stephen S. Grover and Charlie McIntyre, became to the North Beach area what Sam Ben was to the little town of Aberdeen. the Campbells and the Carrs to Hoquiam, and Pilkington to Cosmopolis. They were its beginning. For years, virtually the only white men between the North Harbor and the Native American reservation, they watched the drama of development unfold on the sandy beaches. Charlie McIntyre recalled his last days of a terrible shipwreck in the early years. There was the destruction of the British bark Abercrombie in 1886. Charlie watched the vessel break up as he was on hand to help rescue a handful of survivors. The Abercorn was an iron vessel of 1,262 tons registered under William Irvine. She was en route from Mayport to Portland, Oregon, with a cargo of rails. On a blustery January night, she was driven north from the Columbia and ashored near Ojot. In a tremendous she was dashed ashore at 6 o'clock in the morning, and 14 bodies were washed up on beach. Charlie helped to bury them in a common grave. There was the Ferndale under Captain Blair, proceeding from North Castle to Portland with coal. She struck near where the bones of the Aberdeen were rustling, and on January night in 1892, 18 souls perished in the raging sea. Charlie McIntyre helped with the burials, tended to the 3 men who survived the awful ordeal. And so over the years, Charlie McIntyre became part of the land and the seascape of this North Beach area. The canny Irishman, with a high sense of humor and a keen intelligence and friendly way, grew with the beach area and knew its very dune from the Lone Tree to La Push. And with one thing, perhaps more than any other, Charlie McIntyre's name is still associated with. It is the sea otter hunting and highly skilled business of bagging the valuable sea otters for their hides, a business that required great skill with a rifle and that became a lost art so long ago that it is now more legend than history today. We told you that Stephen Grover was one of the great rifle shots of the young frontier, and his skill he imparted to his Irish friend, and between the two of them they became a historic team along the beaches. Sea otters, which were once numerous along the coast, were the most sought after of fur-bearing animals in the Northwest. They were hunted almost from the dawn of the Northwest annals, and in the years following the American Revolution, almost in the wake of Robert Gray's ship's Columbia, men sailed from Boston around the Horn to be on hand in the sea otter hunting grounds come spring. And the men of other nations, too, sailed their little ships to the Washington coast for this valuable haul. Vast fortunes were made in the trade of otter pelts, and the sea otter occupies much the same place in Northwest histories as do the buffalo of the Great Plains, and like the grazing animals, they were hunted almost to extinction. There are probably no living men who participated in those sea otter hunts of the 1890s. For more than a decade ago, the survivors of the canny fraternity could be counted on your fingers. But 2 of them were McIntyre and Grover. By the time they began to hunt in the middle 1870s, the vast demands of hunting ships had stopped coming, and hunting was handled in a fixed pattern. The Native Americans pursued the animal with spears hurled from war canoes, and frontiermen shot with rifles and towers erected on surfs along the beach. And their tripods, McIntyre and Grover erected in 1876, anywhere from Port Greenville to the harbor mouth. The towers were as much as 50 feet in height and were posted in a box or in a platform so the hunter could scan the surf for telltale signs of the otter's heads. Shooting at the bouncing dot in the surf under any circumstance would be a work for a high-caliber marksman. But when you know that the otters move rapidly, its head was as small, and the range was 400 to 700 yards. You can appreciate the kind of men who squinted down the barrels of a rifle for their sharp rifles' fire. The guns, a .45 caliber weapon, were the same that play such a dramatic part in the early days of the Great Plains crossings and handled a shell about 3 inches long and 100 grains of powder and 500 grain bullets. It was one of the heaviest of shoulder weapons, and it had a terrific wallop. The weight of a ball was one of its advantages. It carried through the wind, holding its way. The hunters at this time, there were many of them on the beaches during the months of May to October, worked in pairs. One ran the beach to pick up the otters brought in by the tide, the other shot from the tower. Many hunters marked their bullets to identify the kill, and in great respect existed between the hunters and the other fellows' skill. Old-timers can't recall a single squabble on the beach resulting from an otter being picked up in the surf by the wrong man. By the time Grover and McIntyre hunted the animals, the pricing was already slim, and in contrast to the hundreds taken by early fleets of huntsmen, a good shot was fortunate to bag a dozen in a season. However, the hides brought a high price. In 1876, they brought from $50 to $75 each. In the years that followed, the price soared due to scarcity and eventually reached $500 a single pelt. By the turn of the century, the animals had become so scarce that it was unprofitable to continue hunting them, and in 1903, the famous team gave up. No little of Charlie McIntyre's years on the harbor were spent with the Native Americans. Charlie had come to the harbor when there were few men on this fringe of wilderness that were not acquainted with the Native Americans, and for 13 years he lived amongst them, learning their customs, counseling them, and finally administering to them as a federal Indian agent. He learned and spoke the peculiar Chinook jargon frequently. It was the universal language of the tribes spoken in the Great Plains West, and was a mix of French, English, and tribal tongues, grunts, and gestures. As federal administrator, Charlie McIntyre sat as the court of laws for the Quinaults, meting out his decisions in a way that taught the Native Americans the fairness of true intent of the settlers' justice. Charlie put teeth into his decision, and the laxity that had existed in law enforcement before his time was forever ended. To Charlie, a sentence was something to be served, and with his 3 associates, all tribesmen, he promoted the verdicts that he thought fitting. Seldom, if ever, were his conclusions contested. As Judge McIntyre, he left a mark on the reservation records of law and order and better government. And so, for more than 60 years, Charlie McIntyre was a fixture in the North Beach area. He was a strong character, and his influence in coastal communities was attested to by his many long and endearing friendships with esteem in which his friends held him. Perhaps the greatest of these links with those about him was his friendship with Grover, which lasted for more than 40 years. It was described as something verging on profound, and one of the greatest tragedies of his life came with the death of his friend he had met beside the lone tree in 1876. Grover died in 1916. If you knew Charlie McIntyre, you will recall, probably with his white patriarchal beard, his keen, piercing blue eyes, and the way they mist over he spoke in the early days amongst the dunes and beaches, the stripes of the blanket of white and darkening out the water, and of the changing skies, the scrub spruce, the rugged frontier to which the Irish boy of 23 came straight as an arrow to fly, and which he never left until death dimmed the keen eyes of the otter hunter and the strong arm of the pioneer. Surely in all of Grays Harbor's intriguing history, there were none more part of the Northwest than this old-timer whom we find tonight on the pages of our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.